I came home from my father's funeral thinking I'd buried our unfinished history years ago. Then, in the middle of one cold night under his roof, I overheard my mother whisper, "He deserves to know," and realized my father had left behind one last secret that could split my family wide open. I was 38 years old when I came back to my hometown for my father's funeral, and the whole drive from the airport felt like I was moving backward through my own life. The town hadn't changed much. Same cracked sidewalks, same old brick storefronts with faded signs, same church steeple cutting into the gray afternoon sky like a nail. Even the air smelled the same. Wet leaves, cold stone, and chimney smoke. It was late November in western Pennsylvania, the kind of cold that didn't hit all at once. It slipped under your coat and sat there, patient, until your bones noticed. I hadn't been back in almost 11 years. That fact sat in my chest heavier than my suitcase in the trunk. People love to pretend time heals families. It doesn't. Most of the time, it just spreads the damage out so it looks less dramatic from a distance. Up close, the cracks are still there, sometimes deeper, sometimes sharp enough to cut you open all over again. My name is Nolan Mercer. I'm an architect in Seattle now, or at least that's the clean version. The messier version is that I was the son who left, the one who stopped calling, the one my mother referred to in stiff, careful sentences whenever someone at church asked how I was doing. Nolan's out west. Nolan is busy with work. Nolan couldn't make it this year. That last one had covered a lot of holidays. When my father died, my mother didn't call me herself. My younger brother Caleb did. That should tell you almost everything you need to know. I was in my office reviewing a hotel renovation budget when my phone buzzed with a number I hadn't seen in months. I nearly let it ring out. Caleb and I were never close, and whenever he called, it usually meant one of two things: bad news or family pressure. Sometimes both. I answered anyway. His voice sounded strange, flat, hollowed out. "Nolan," he said. "Dad's gone." For a second, I just stared through the glass wall of my office at the rain sliding down the Seattle skyline. People were moving outside with coffee cups and umbrellas, normal life continuing with almost insulting confidence, while something old and buried cracked inside me. "How?" I asked. "Heart attack. Sunday night. Mom found him in the den." I sat down slowly. My knees had gone weak without asking permission. There are losses you prepare for. Then there are losses that force your body to react before your mind catches up. My fingers turned cold. My mouth dried out. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. "When's the funeral?" "Thursday." "Saint Bartholomew." Of course it was St. Bartholomew. The same church where I was baptized. The same church where my parents renewed their vows on their 25th anniversary. The same church where, when I was 16, Father Harlan told me family was a sacred responsibility after he caught me saying I couldn't wait to leave this town. I almost laughed at the memory. "Almost. I'll be there," I said. Caleb was quiet for a beat too long. "Mom didn't think you'd come." That one landed exactly where he meant it to. I looked down at the blueprints spread across my desk, but they blurred. "Well," I said, my voice rougher than I wanted, "Mom's wrong. After we hung up, I didn't move for a long time. I wish I could tell you my father and I had some dramatic final falling out. Something clear, something cinematic, a slammed door, a shouted insult, a line you never come back from. But that wasn't us. What happened between me and my father was slower, colder, more ordinary, which somehow made it worse. My father, Thomas Mercer, was one of those men who could fill a room without raising his voice. He owned a hardware supply company his father had built, and in our town that made him respectable in the old-fashioned way. Not flashy, not rich enough for magazine covers, just solid, reliable. The kind of man people trusted to chair a fundraiser, or settle a zoning dispute, or drive over in the middle of a snowstorm if your furnace went out. To everyone else, he was steady. To me, He was impossible to read. When I was little, I worshipped him. I followed him around the garage, handed him tools, watched the careful way he measured things, fixed things, built things. He was the first person who taught me that drawings could become walls, roofs, windows, places people lived inside. Maybe that's why I became an architect. Maybe everything in my life started there. But as I got older, something shifted. Or maybe I just became old enough to notice what had always been there. Caleb fit him better. Caleb liked the business, liked the town, liked the church breakfasts and the football games and the easy rhythm of a life already mapped out for him. He laughed at the right moments, shook the right hands, knew how to be the kind of son people praised in public. I was different. Restless, head full of sketches and plans and cities I'd never seen. I wanted out long before I knew where out was. My mother used to say I had my father's eyes and my own mind, and she said it like both things were blessings. My father never seemed so sure. By the time I was 18, every conversation between us felt like a test I didn't know I was taking. You going to come back after college? I don't know. You don't know, or you don't want to? What's the difference? His jaw had tightened at that. The difference is one answer still sounds like a son. That was how he was. Never openly cruel, just precise. He could make you feel disloyal with one sentence and still look like the reasonable one. I left for Chicago first, then Boston, then Seattle. I built a life from deadlines, client calls, red-eye flights, and apartments with views too expensive to feel like home. I told myself distance was healthy, necessary even. And maybe at first it was. But distance has a way of becoming habit. I came home less, called less, then only on birthdays. Then when Mom texted first, Dad and I settled into something polite and bloodless. We'd speak twice a year, maybe 3 times if there was some family update too big to avoid. He'd ask about work. I'd ask about his blood pressure or the store or the weather, like weather was enough to bridge a decade. Neither of us ever said the real thing. Why was it easier with Caleb? Why did I always feel like I was standing outside my own family, looking in through a window? Why did every room in that house feel warmer when I was gone? When I landed back in Pennsylvania, the sky was low and colorless. I rented a black sedan and drove the familiar roads with both hands tight on the steering wheel. Bare trees lined the highway like witnesses. Every exit sign stirred some old memory I didn't ask for. The diner where Dad taught me how to leave a proper tip. The field where Caleb broke his wrist in 8th grade and somehow turned it into a story Dad still told with pride. The pharmacy where Mom bought my first sketchbook after a teacher said I had talent. By the time I reached town, my shoulders were rigid with tension. I didn't go to my mother's house first. I went to the church. I don't know why exactly. Maybe I wanted to see it empty before it filled with casseroles, condolences, and people pretending they knew what my father meant to me. Maybe I needed a few minutes alone before stepping back into a family system that had spent years teaching me where not to stand. St. Bartholomew sat at the top of a small hill, its stone walls darkened by damp weather. The parking lot was half full already. I killed the engine and sat there, staring at the front doors. My hands were sweating. That surprised me. I'd presented to investors, negotiated 7-figure contracts, walked into boardrooms full of men who wanted me to fail. But sitting in that car outside my childhood church, I felt 16 again. Wrong-footed, racing. Like if I opened that door, the version of me I'd spent 11 years building might crack. I stepped out anyway. The wind hit hard. My tie shifted against my throat. Somewhere nearby, a bell rang once, then stopped. Inside, the church smelled like candles and old wood polish. Quiet footsteps echoed across the stone floor. Volunteers were arranging flowers near the altar. Someone was testing the organ softly. Just a few notes. Then silence again. And there, near the front pew, stood my mother. Elaine Mercer had gone smaller in the years I'd been away. Not weaker exactly, just finer around the edges. like grief had already started sanding her down. She wore black, of course. Her shoulders were straight. Her hair, once dark chestnut, was now mostly silver and pinned neatly at the back. When she turned and saw me, her face changed in a way that made my throat tighten. Not joy, not anger, something more dangerous. Relief she didn't want to show. "Nolan," she said. I walked toward her, suddenly unsure whether to hug her. She solved it for me by stepping forward first, and when her arms wrapped around me, I felt how thin she'd gotten. "You came," she whispered. I swallowed hard. "Yeah." She pulled back, eyes scanning my face like she was checking what time had done to me. "You look tired." "So do you." A faint, brittle smile touched her mouth. "Well, funerals will do that." I wanted to ask 100 things. How bad was it? Was he in pain? Did he say anything before he died? Did he ever ask about me when I wasn't there to hear it? But the words crowded in my chest and stayed there. Instead, I looked toward the altar and asked, "Where's Caleb?" "Outside with Pastor Daniel. They're going over the service." Pastor Daniel. Not Father Harlan. I'd forgotten the old priest had retired. "Mom," I said carefully, "why didn't you call me?" Her expression shuddered for just a second. "I didn't know if you'd want to hear my voice," she said. That one hurt because it was honest. I looked away, jaw tight, and in that moment I felt it again. That old tension in the walls. The sense that I had arrived too late to something that had been happening for years without me. And I didn't know it yet, not fully, but standing there in the cold light of that church, with my father dead and my mother watching me like I was both son and stranger, the first crack was already opening. By the next morning, it would split everything I thought I knew about my family. Caleb came in a few minutes later with that same careful stride I remembered from high school, like he was always walking into a room he already belonged in. He was 34 now, broader in the shoulders than I was, dressed in a navy suit that fit him too well to be off the rack. His hair was trimmed short, wedding ring, polished shoes, the whole picture of stability. He stopped when he saw me. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he nodded once and said, "You made it." Not hello, not good to see you, just that. I said I would. "Yeah." He glanced toward Mom, then back at me. "Didn't know if your flight would get delayed." There it was, that old Mercer family style. Emotion wrapped in logistics. I almost smiled, almost. He came closer and offered a handshake like we were meeting at a networking event, not standing 10 feet from our father's casket. I looked at his hand, then at his face, and finally took it. His grip was firm, dry, controlled. "How's Mom holding up?" I asked. Caleb exhaled through his nose. "About how you'd expect." Mom turned away then, fussing with one of the flower arrangements that didn't need fussing. That was her tell. Whenever the air got too heavy, she found something practical to do with her hands. I looked past Caleb toward the front of the church and finally saw the casket. Closed. Dark walnut. Brass handles. Clean lines. My father would have approved of the workmanship, which was such a strange thought that it nearly knocked the breath out of me. A closed casket. I don't know why that hit so hard. Maybe because some irrational part of me had expected to see him. To stand there and force my mind to catch up with what my brother had said on the phone. Gone. Final. Finished. But the closed lid felt like one last act of distance. No explanation, no access. Just polished wood and silence. "When did they bring him in?" I asked quietly. "This morning?" I nodded, but my eyes stayed on the casket. The church seemed too warm all of a sudden. My collar felt tight. My palms were damp again. Caleb noticed. "You okay?" It annoyed me that he asked it gently. "Fine." He gave me a look that said he didn't believe me, but didn't care enough to push. That was our whole relationship in one glance. By late afternoon, the church had turned into what funerals always become in small towns. A slow-moving current of casseroles, murmured sympathy, and people with damp eyes telling stories you didn't know whether to be grateful for or resentful of. I stood beside Mom through most of it. Men from the hardware business shook my hand and told me my father had been one of the good ones. Women from church said they remembered me as a boy, and then looked vaguely embarrassed when they realized I was no longer the age they'd frozen me at in memory. A retired contractor named Pete Donnelly clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Your dad talked about your buildings, you know. Didn't always understand what the hell half of them were supposed to be, but he clipped every article." That one stopped me cold. "What?" Pete blinked. "The magazine pieces, trade stuff, Seattle Business Journal, Architecture Monthly. Hell, he had a folder in the office. Showed me once after your hotel project won that award." I looked toward Caleb instinctively, but he was across the room talking to Pastor Daniel. My father had clipped my articles. For a moment, the room sounded muffled, like I was underwater. I could hear my own heartbeat again. Slow, heavy, confused. Pete kept talking, not noticing what he'd done. "Proud as anything. Didn't say it in a big way, you know how Tom was. But he kept up with you." I nodded because I didn't trust my mouth. "Thanks," I said finally. He squeezed my shoulder once and moved on. I stood there staring at nothing. Proud as anything. That didn't fit the man I remembered. Or maybe it did and I had never been close enough to see it. That thought made something twist deep in my chest. Regret, maybe. Or anger at all the years wasted on silence when apparently neither of us had said what mattered. In that moment, I almost hated him for dying before I could ask which version was true. The father who made me feel like I was always failing some invisible standard, or the man who quietly clipped my articles and kept them in a folder. Maybe both. That possibility unsettled me more than either answer would have. The visitation ended just before 7. The crowd thinned. Chairs were straightened. Candle flames flickered lower. Outside, dusk had settled across the parking lot, blue and cold. Mom looked exhausted. Not dramatic, not collapsing, just emptied out. She moved with the careful precision of someone who had decided that if she stopped, even for a second, she might not start again. "Come back to the house," she said as she buttoned her coat. I hesitated. She noticed. "It's still your home too, Nolan." That sentence landed with more force than she probably intended. Caleb grabbed the flower cards and one of the casserole trays someone had insisted we take. "I'll drive behind you," he said. So that was how it happened. 11 years away, and I came back to my childhood home in a quiet 2-car procession after my father's visitation. The house looked smaller than I remembered. That's what people always say, and it's true in the most unnerving way. The porch where we used to sit on summer nights looked narrow. The front yard, once huge enough for football and sprinkler fights and stupid brotherly wars, now looked like a modest patch of winter grass bordered by tired hedges. The porch light cast a yellow cone onto the steps, and for one disorienting second I saw us as boys again. Caleb racing ahead, me carrying too much, Dad locking the truck, Mom shouting through the screen door that dinner was getting cold. Then the image vanished, and all that remained was the quiet house of a dead man. Inside, the smell hit me first. Coffee, old wood, lemon cleaner, and underneath it all, faint but unmistakable, my mother's cinnamon candles. Memory is cruel that way. It doesn't knock. It floods. I slipped off my coat slowly, eyes moving across the living room. Same fireplace, same bookshelf, same framed landscape over the mantel. But there were differences too. New curtains, a replaced armchair, fewer photographs than I remembered. I noticed that last part immediately. There were pictures of Caleb and his wife, Jenna. Pictures of their 2 boys. Church events, fishing trips, holiday dinners. Mom with the grandchildren. Dad at some Rotary Club luncheon. There were almost none of me. Not none, but close. A high school graduation photo tucked beside a lamp. A family Christmas picture from maybe 15 years ago, half hidden behind a ceramic angel. That was it. I don't know why that bothered me as much as it did. Maybe because it confirmed the story I'd been telling myself for years. Caleb had remained. I had left. The walls had adjusted accordingly. Mom went straight to the kitchen. Caleb followed with the tray. I stayed in the doorway of the living room, listening to cabinet doors open and close, and felt like a guest in a museum exhibit about my own life. Then I saw it. On the far side of the room, just beyond the den entrance, was my father's office door, closed. That door had been shut half my childhood. Not locked exactly, but never welcoming. It was where he did accounts, reviewed invoices, made calls, and stored all the practical machinery of adulthood I used to imagine I'd understand one day. As kids, Caleb and I weren't forbidden from going in, but the room had always carried a kind of weight, quiet, order, his presence. Now the light under the door was off, dark. I stared at it longer than I meant to. "Coffee?" Mom called from the kitchen. "Yeah," I answered. At the table, the three of us settled into the old family geometry without discussing it. Mom at the head, Caleb to her right, me across from him. Steam rose from our mugs, the clock over the stove ticked too loudly. No one touched the casserole. Mom folded and refolded a paper napkin. Caleb checked his phone once, then set it face down when he caught me noticing. Finally, I said, "Pete Donnelly told me Dad kept clippings of my projects." Mom's hands stopped moving. Caleb looked up. "Did he?" Mom nodded once. "In his office." I leaned back slightly. "He never mentioned that." "No," she said. "He wouldn't have." "Why not?" She gave me a tired look. "Because your father found direct affection almost physically painful." Despite everything, a short laugh escaped me. Caleb huffed one too. The first real sound between us all day. Mom took a sip of coffee. "He was proud of you, Nolan." She searched for the word. "He thought saying it too often made a person soft." "That sounds like him." "It was stupid," she said quietly. "But it was him." The room went still. I looked at her. Really looked. Her face was lined in ways I hadn't fully registered at church. Grief had sharpened her. But there was something else there too. Fatigue, yes, and maybe resentment. Not toward me exactly. Toward time. Toward my father. Toward all the things people leave unsaid, until death turns them into burdens for the living. "I should have come home more," I said before I could stop myself. Mom didn't answer right away. Caleb did. "Yeah, you probably should have." The words were simple. The tone wasn't. I looked at him. "You want to do this tonight?" He held my gaze. "I'm not doing anything. I'm just agreeing with you." Mom set her mug down harder than necessary. "Enough. But once something starts in a family, it doesn't stop because someone says enough. It just changes shape." Caleb leaned back in his chair, jaw tight. "You got to leave, Nolan. That was always your move. Fly in, fly out, keep your distance, act like that distance didn't cost anybody anything." I felt heat rise up my neck. "You think I don't know what it cost? I don't know what you know. You were gone. There it was again. Gone. Like I had died in installments." I called. Twice a year. I came when I could. Caleb actually laughed then, but there was no humor in it. "You came when it was convenient. Big difference." Mom closed her eyes briefly, like she was listening to a noise she'd heard too many times before. I stared at my brother and saw all the old resentments lined up behind his face. Not just this week. Not just Dad. Years of them. "You always loved this," I said. His brow furrowed. "Loved what?" "Being the good son. The one who stayed. The one who got to stand closest to the throne." He pushed back from the table a few inches. "You think staying here was some kind of prize? At least you were here." "Yeah," he snapped. I was. I was here for Dad's blood pressure scare 3 years ago. I was here when Mom fell on the ice. I was here every Sunday dinner, every doctor appointment, every repair, every holiday where she set an extra plate just in case you changed your mind and showed up. That shut me up because I could picture it too easily. Mom in this very kitchen, extra plate, extra hope. Then the careful voice. Maybe next time, Caleb stood. You don't get to breeze in now and act like you were misunderstood for 11 years. Some of us were busy doing the actual work. He walked out before I could answer. His footsteps crossed the living room. A door opened, closed. The silence afterward was brutal. Mom looked down into her coffee. He's angry, she said. I noticed. He's also tired. I rubbed a hand over my face. So am I. She nodded. I know. That should have comforted me. It didn't. Because underneath the argument, under the grief, under all the old family roles snapping back into place, I could feel something else in the house. Something unfinished. Something waiting, and I didn't understand it yet. But when Mom finally rose from the table and told me the guest room was made up upstairs, her voice had that same strained, careful quality it had at the church. Like she was carrying another thought she hadn't decided whether to speak. I almost asked what it was. Almost. Instead, I took my bag, climbed the stairs, and walked into the room where I had slept as a teenager. The wallpaper was different. The bed was new, but the window still looked out over the side yard and the old maple tree, black against the night sky. I stood there in the dark for a long time. Then, downstairs, I heard it, my mother's voice. Low, tense, and Caleb answering her in an urgent whisper. I couldn't make out every word through the floorboards, only fragments. Not tonight. He deserves to know. Dad wanted, then silence. I went very still. In that moment, I realized something far worse than simple family resentment was sitting in this house with us. And whatever it was, my father had died before telling me himself. I stood in the dark a few seconds longer. Every muscle in my body pulled tight. The house had gone quiet again, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. This one had edges. It pressed against the walls and settled under my skin. I opened the bedroom door without turning on the light and stepped into the hallway. The old wooden floor gave a soft creak under my weight. Downstairs, a lamp was still on in the living room, spilling a pale amber glow across the staircase. I moved slowly, one hand grazing the banister, listening. No voices now, only the grandfather clock in the hall. Tick, tick, tick. When I reached the bottom, I saw my mother standing by the sink in the kitchen, with both hands braced against the counter. Caleb was near the back door, coat already on, car keys in his hand. They both turned when they saw me. That told me everything. Whatever they'd been discussing, it was about me. What did Dad want? I asked. No one answered. I stepped off the last stair. I heard you. Mom straightened too quickly, like she'd been caught stealing. Nolan, it's late. Don't do that. My voice came out sharper than I intended. Don't tell me it's late. Don't tell me tomorrow is better. I've been in this house less than 12 hours, and I can feel everybody walking around some secret like it has its own chair at the table. So just tell me. Caleb looked at Mom first. That irritated me more than it should have. Tell him, I said. Mom closed her eyes for a second, then opened them. They looked older in that kitchen light. More tired, more afraid. It's in your father's office, she said quietly. I stared at her. What is? She swallowed. A letter and some documents. He left instructions that you were to read them here. After the visitation. Before the funeral, the room seemed to tilt. A letter? I repeated. For me? Mom nodded. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Why didn't you say that the second I walked in? Because today was already hard enough, she said. And now there was strain in her voice too. Because your brother and I didn't know if tonight was the right time. Because your father made me promise it would be after you came back into this house. Not before. Not over the phone. Not by mail. He was very specific. I laughed once, but it came out hollow. Still controlling things from the grave? That sounds like him. Nolan, Mom said, but I was already looking past her toward the dark office door. Caleb spoke then, his voice lower than before. Dad worked on that letter for weeks, maybe longer. After the second hospital visit, I turned to him. Second hospital visit? He frowned. You didn't know? Of course I didn't know. That answer must have shown on my face, because something in Caleb's expression shifted. Not softer exactly, just less certain. Mom reached into the kitchen drawer, pulled out a small brass key, and held it out to me. Her hand was trembling. He locked the bottom drawer of his desk, she said. Said only you were to open it. I didn't take the key right away. There was suddenly too much in the air. Hospital visits. Instructions. A locked drawer. A letter written over weeks. My father, the man who could barely say good job without sounding like he was negotiating a contract, had apparently spent his final months preparing something for me. For me. The son who left. I took the key. It felt colder than it should have. The office smelled exactly the way I remembered. Paper. Dust. Coffee gone stale in ceramic. The faint metallic scent of old filing cabinets. Mom had turned on the desk lamp before stepping back out, leaving me alone in a warm pool of yellow light. The room was painfully neat, legal pads stacked square, pens aligned in a mug from the hardware company's 30th anniversary, ledger books on the shelves, framed certificates on the wall. And on the far corner of the desk, tucked beside a green banker's lamp, was a photo of me and Dad from when I was maybe 12. I froze. I had never seen that picture in this room before. We were standing beside the frame of a half-built shed in the backyard, both wearing tool belts too big for us. Dad's arm was draped over my shoulder. Not stiffly, but naturally. I was grinning at the camera with two missing front teeth. He was looking at me instead of the lens. I picked up the frame with numb fingers. In that moment, something cracked inside me. Not all the way, just enough to hurt. I set it down carefully and sat in his chair. The bottom right drawer was locked. I slid the brass key in, turned it, and heard the small metallic click. Inside was a large manila envelope with my name written across the front in my father's handwriting, Nolan. Nothing else. No son, no date. Just my name, written in blue ink that had pressed hard enough into the paper to leave grooves. Under the envelope sat a thinner stack of files, clipped together, and a small black flash drive. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Then I opened the envelope. The letter inside was 6 pages long, handwritten, and the first line hit me so hard I had to read it twice. Nolan, if you're reading this, then I ran out of time to say these things badly in person. I let out a sound, somewhere between a laugh and a choke. That was him. Even here. Even now. Dry, guarded. Trying to soften a confession with awkward humor. I kept reading. He wrote that he knew I thought he hadn't seen me clearly for years. He wrote that the older I got, the more I reminded him of the parts of himself he had buried to become the man his father expected. Ambition, restlessness, the refusal to stay in one place just because it made other people comfortable. When you left, he wrote, I told myself I was angry because you were rejecting this family. The truth is uglier. I was angry because you were brave enough to do what I never was. I stopped there. My eyes burned. I stared at the page until the words blurred and sharpened again. Brave enough. My father had never used that word for me. Not once in my life. Not to my face. I kept reading. He admitted he had relied on Caleb too heavily. Leaned on him because Caleb stayed. Because Caleb made fewer waves. Because the business, the church, the town, all the machinery of his life fit more easily around him. He said that wasn't love measured out differently, but fear disguised as practicality. Then came the line that made my stomach drop. There are things about this family's finances your mother does not fully know, and things your brother knows only in part. That was my doing. Another mistake among many. I sat up straighter. He went on to explain. 8 years ago, after the hardware company nearly folded during a supplier collapse, he had sold the commercial property behind the main warehouse and quietly invested the money, along with a large portion of his personal savings, into a development trust. Not for Caleb, not for the business, for me. I actually said "what" out loud to an empty room. My father wrote that he had followed my work from Seattle and Chicago before that. He had seen the affordable housing proposals, the restoration projects, the articles where I talked about architecture as dignity, not just profit. He wrote that he had disagreed with half my ideas and admired all of them. So I did the only foolish, sentimental thing I've done with money in my life, he wrote. I set aside enough to help you build something when the time came, if you ever wanted to come home or do good somewhere else in this state. My hands were shaking now. I grabbed the file stack from the drawer and opened it on the desk. Trust formation documents, property transfer records, investment statements, legal correspondence. The amount at the bottom of the latest valuation page made my vision swim. $3.8 million. I leaned back hard in the chair. $3.8 million. Not a symbolic gesture. Not some old savings bond or tiny account he'd forgotten to mention. This was real money. Structured. Protected. Built over years. And none of it had gone to Caleb. None of it had gone through Mom. It was all in a trust under my name, with release contingent on one thing: my personal appearance and signature after his death. My father had built a future for me in secret. I read the next page of the letter with my heart hammering. He said he kept it hidden because he knew what would happen if the family knew too early. Resentment, pressure, demands. He said Caleb would feel replaced. Mom would worry, and I would likely refuse it out of pride if he offered it clumsily during one of our brittle phone calls. He was probably right. Then his handwriting changed. Less steady, more crowded. There is another reason I am leaving this to you privately. Caleb has debts. I went cold. Serious ones, he wrote. Not just the mortgage. Not just family expenses. Business loans tied to a side venture he concealed from your mother and me until too late. I helped him more than once, then more than twice. I told myself that was what fathers do. The truth is, I was trying to solve with money what should have been solved with honesty. I stared at the page, pulse thudding. That was why Caleb had been so tense. Why Mom had looked worn thin in a way grief alone didn't explain. Why the walls in this house felt like they were holding their breath. Dad wrote that Caleb knew there was something set aside for me, but not how much. He wrote that he did not trust the situation to remain clean after his death if I stayed away too long. If you have come back, he wrote, then for once I ask you not to run from a hard thing. Not for me, for your mother, and maybe, if you can manage it, for your brother too. Though he may not deserve your help in the ways he expects. I put the letter down. My chest hurt. All those years, I had built a clean story because clean stories are easier to survive. Caleb the favored son. Me the outsider. Dad the cold man who never understood me. Mom the peacemaker trapped in the middle. But real families aren't clean. They're knots. Old ones. Tightened by pride and silence, and the terrible habit of loving people badly while insisting it still counts. A knock came softly at the office door. I looked up. Mom stood there, one arm wrapped around herself. Well, she asked. I couldn't answer right away. Finally, I said, you didn't know? Not all of it. Her voice was thin. I knew he'd done something. I knew there was money he moved after the warehouse sale. but he told me it was business restructuring. Then later, when he got sick, he only said there were things he needed to make right. I looked down at the documents again. Caleb has debts. She closed her eyes. Yes. How bad? She came in then and sat in the chair across from the desk, the one clients used to sit in. She looked so small there that my anger had nowhere easy to land. Bad enough, she said, that your father paid off nearly 200,000 over the last 4 years. Maybe more. Credit lines, a failed landscaping equipment partnership, personal guarantees he never should have signed. And Caleb let him? Mom gave a sad little smile. You say that like fathers are easy to stop. I rubbed both hands over my face. Does Caleb know about the trust? He knows there's money. He doesn't know the final amount. And he wanted me told tonight because he's afraid, she said. Afraid of what this means. Afraid you'll think we all lied to you. Afraid there'll be nothing left for him. Afraid you'll do what he thinks you always do. Leave. She nodded. The word hung between us. I looked back at the letter, at the slanted lines from my father's hand, and suddenly grief hit me in its ugliest form. Not the noble kind, not the cinematic kind, the ugly one, the one made of lost timing and useless pride, and the unbearable knowledge that a man you thought you understood had been carrying love for you in the worst possible shape all along. I hate that he waited, I said, voice breaking. Mom's eyes filled instantly. So do I. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then I asked the question that had been rising in me since the first page. Did he ever say he was sorry? Mom looked at me with an expression so naked it almost made me look away. Not in one clean sentence, she said, but near the end, he asked me if I thought a son could forgive a father who loved him wrong. That did it. I bent forward and covered my face with my hands, and the sob that came out of me was low and rough and years overdue, not just for my father, for all of it, for being 18 and desperate to leave, for being 38 and still wanting one clear blessing from a dead man, for every clipped article one never knew existed, for every phone call where we both chose weather over truth. Mom came around the desk and put her arms around me the way she had when I was a boy with a fever. I'm here, she whispered. And for the first time since Caleb's call, I let myself grieve like a son, not the successful architect from Seattle, not the absent brother, not the man who left, just a son. By morning, nothing would be simple. Caleb would still have debts. The funeral would still happen. The trust would still sit on that desk like a lit fuse waiting for the family to acknowledge what it meant. But in that office, under the yellow desk lamp, with my father's letter open in front of me and my mother's hand resting on my shoulder, I understood something that changed everything. He had failed me, and he had loved me. And he had loved me. Both were true. And now the hard part was mine.